Carlos was at the checkpoint, carefully observing the movement in the peripheral neighborhood where the operations always began. As an experienced police officer, he knew where to look, who to attack, and who would be the target. The city, like so many others, was marked by problems of violence, traffic, and inequality, and he, Carlos, was at the center of it all. However, his gaze was relentless, as if his presence were the last line of defense against chaos. He was proud of this, of being the figure of order in a place without hope. Today, the operation had a specific target: Lucas, a 19-year-old young man who Carlos saw crossing the street in a seemingly innocent moment, but who, to him, gave off the smell of something bad. The police officer quickly looked at his partner, Silva, a younger police officer who accompanied him in the investigation. "Let's go after him," Carlos ordered firmly. Silva hesitated a bit, but followed the order, trusting in his superior's experience. The chase wasn't difficult. Lucas didn't seem to be particularly fast or skilled at avoiding the approach. Maybe he hadn't expected them to approach him so quickly, but his expression showed that something wasn't right. He tried to pull away, but Carlos grabbed him tightly and didn't give him a chance to explain. "Come here, kid!" Carlos yelled as he pushed Lucas against the wall. He could feel the tension rising in the air. "You're in a neighborhood dominated by drug dealers. I think you know what's going on here." Lucas, visibly scared, tried to argue, but his words were too shaky for anyone to believe. He had nothing to hide, but he already knew the situation was getting dangerous. "I'm not a drug dealer," Lucas insisted, looking at Carlos with a mixture of fear and frustration. But the police officer's response was brief and harsh. "We'll figure this out at the police station," Carlos said, as he put the handcuffs on the young man's wrists. He didn't listen to the pleas. In Carlos's eyes, Lucas fit the mold of a criminal perfectly. Just another one, he thought. Just another one the police would have to catch, and soon he would disappear into the system where the truth mattered little. The police officer felt like a hero in his own narrative, where all he did was justify the order. As he walked him to the car, Carlos didn't even look deeply into Lucas's face. There was no time for feelings. He had a mission, and that was all that mattered. But something in the back of his mind was starting to worry him. It was a strange feeling, one he didn't want to face, but one that seemed to grow, albeit timidly. Maybe it was the young man's expression. Maybe it was his gaze, which seemed to be begging for a chance to defend himself. But the policeman didn't want to think about that. "I was sure I had done the right thing." The path was clear, and the mission would go forward. That afternoon, the atmosphere at the police station was tense. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and the sound of muffled conversations mixed with the clicking of computer keys. Carlos walked steadily through the hallways, following Lucas, who remained silent. The young man looked emaciated, and Carlos couldn't shake the strange feeling that was bothering him. But he forced himself to ignore it, to maintain his authority. "Go to your cell," Carlos told the officer at the entrance to the detention wing. The young man was rudely pushed inside, his feet dragging on the floor. His handcuffed hands and hunched posture made him look even more vulnerable, but that didn't interest the officer. He simply saw him as just another criminal who would soon be tried and sentenced, like everyone else who crossed his path. Lucas was placed in an isolated cell, the same one where so many other young people had been imprisoned and abandoned. The dirty walls, the rancid smell, and the sound of distant voices were nothing new to him. The silence seemed to weigh more heavily with each passing second. I knew what was happening, but I didn't know how to react. He wasn't a criminal. He never had been. But Carlos's gaze, so relentless, seemed to have the power to sow doubts in his own mind. "You have the right to remain silent, but if you want to explain yourself, you can speak to your lawyer," said one of the officers, looking at him indifferently. Lucas didn't know what to say. He wanted to scream. He wanted to explain that he was just another young man trying to survive, But he knew that no one would listen to him. The justice machine was in motion, and he was just a cog in the wheel. Carlos watched from afar, sitting at his desk, filling out reports and trying to keep his mind occupied. The young man was behind bars, exactly where he thought he should be. Every detail of Lucas's arrest, from the moment he was approached to the moment he was locked up, seemed to have been justified, with no room for regrets. But as the hours passed, the weight of the silence became more present. There was something in Lucas's eyes that bothered Carlos. It was the same look he had seen in his own son, Vinicius, years ago, when the boy had been at home before the accident. The memory of his lost son came to him abruptly, but he pushed it away. There was no connection between it and Lucas. He was an ordinary young man, lost in a cruel system. The police officer returned to his focus on what was in front of him, the drug trafficking case. Carlos didn't want to admit it, but something was bothering him, a feeling he couldn't shake. It wasn't a feeling of regret, but rather of uncertainty. He turned to his computer and began typing. According to the records, Lucas had a history of involvement in minor crimes, but nothing substantial. It was typical crime in a neighborhood like this. Petty theft, fights, a life marked by marginalization. But drug trafficking, that didn't make sense. Meanwhile, in his cell, Lucas felt the weight of being treated like a criminal. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but no one seemed willing to believe him. He felt anger rising inside him, anger at the situation, anger at the system, but mostly anger at himself for not knowing how to fight it. He wanted to scream, to rebel, but he knew that would only make the pain worse. Hours passed until Carlos finally left his desk and approached the cell. Doubt was growing in his mind, but he didn't know how to face it. He approached Lucas, staring at the young man. Lucas's look was not one of defiance, but of frustration and fear. The officer felt a slight sense of regret, but refused to express it. "They accuse you of drug trafficking," Carlos said, with a coldness that did not match the discomfort he was beginning to feel. "If you want to have a chance, cooperate. But if you continue with this attitude, you will sink even deeper." Lucas didn't answer. He simply stared at the ground, feeling the weight of the judgment being imposed on him. What else could I say? Nothing seemed to matter. He was trapped, like so many others, and no amount of effort on his part would change that. Carlos turned around, feeling a weight on his chest. I knew something was wrong, but he couldn't afford to question his own authority. I needed to maintain control. The courtroom was packed that morning. The chairs were lined up in neat rows, but the tension in the air was palpable. Carlos, as the main witness, sat in one of the front rows, watching young Lucas, who, now with a lawyer at his side, looked increasingly exhausted. The police officer could not help but feel uncomfortable, but the situation was beyond any doubt personal. He was part of the system, and as such, he was there to do his duty. The judge entered the room, making everyone stand up. The courtroom fell silent as he took his seat. Anticipation for the trial was at its peak, but for Carlos, everything was already decided. He had the reports, the evidence he believed would be enough to convict Lucas. For him, the case was clear. Drug trafficking. Another story of a young man lost in a system he didn't know how to avoid. "The process can begin," the judge said. The defense attorney stood up and began his argument, emphasizing that Lucas had not been found with drugs and was in fact just a young man trying to survive in a dangerous environment. He questioned Carlos's evidence and pointed out that the young man had no serious criminal record. Carlos sat listening, but his mind wasn't on the court. He was remembering Lucas's words, the look in his eyes, the genuine fear he saw on the young man's face. But at the same time, the rational part of him was telling him that what mattered was the trial, the evidence. The fear he felt couldn't affect his decision. He was simply doing his job. The prosecution continued its course, and soon it was Carlos's turn to testify. He stood firm, feeling that he was about to give the final word that would solidify the truth. The room was completely silent. He began to explain the approach, the reasons for Lucas's arrest, and the fact that the young man was in an area known for criminal activity. "I did my job. I was where I shouldn't have been, and in the situation we're in, we can't afford to make assumptions," Carlos said, his voice firm but lacking the certainty he usually had. Something inside him was beginning to doubt, but he pushed it away. The defense attorney looked calmly at Carlos and asked, "So, sir, do you think that just because Lucas is in an area known for drug trafficking, he should be arrested without any concrete evidence?" Carlos felt the weight of the question. It was a subtle but powerful statement. He swallowed hard. "I am paid to protect society. I have to do that based on the information I have." His voice wasn't as steady as before. He could feel everyone's eyes on him, especially Lucas's. Those eyes that were no longer just filled with fear, but also with something deeper, the need for justice. Then the judge paused and looked at Carlos. The room seemed to shrink in size. He asked one last question, simple but sharp. "Are you sure you're doing the right thing, Carlos?" The words fell heavily on him, like an iron curtain. He tried to maintain his composure, but a wave of insecurity washed over him. For a moment, Carlos didn't know what to say. He felt as if the entire weight of the system, all his choices and actions, were pressing down on his chest. He knew on some level that what he was doing wasn't right, but how could he go back? "Yes," he finally replied, with a firmness that sounded more like a statement of conviction than a genuine truth. "Yes, I'm sure." The trial continued, but for Carlos the rest of that day became a vague memory. At every moment he felt the nagging feeling that something was not right, but he refused to face the doubt. He was right, I was doing the right thing. But when the final sentence was announced, Carlos couldn't help but look at Lucas, whose expression was one of resignation, but also of something deeper. An anticipation for something he didn't yet understand, but knew was about to be revealed. The sound of the respirator, mixed with the constant silence of the hospital, created a tense and oppressive atmosphere. Carlos stood at the door of the room, hesitant. I knew that this moment had arrived. After weeks of trial, he would finally have to face the consequences of his actions. Lucas was there, unconscious, but Carlos knew that this meeting would be the key to understanding everything. The young man was in a coma, and doctors warned that the chances of him waking up were slim. The violence of the attack by Carlos and his uniformed companions, combined with the fact that Lucas did not receive immediate medical attention, left the boy's body weakened on the brink of death. Carlos, however, felt the weight of responsibility like a stone on his chest. He was there, once again, not as a police officer, but as a man who could no longer ignore the weight of doubt that was growing inside him. Those words the judge had said to him, the question he had asked him during the trial, still echoed in his mind. He looked at Lucas, lying on the bed, with his eyes closed and breathing heavily. There was no longer any way to deny what was happening. He walked into the room, the sound of his boots echoing on the linoleum floor. He felt a sick feeling, but he didn't stop. As he approached the bed, the doctor looked at him for a moment, debating whether or not to intervene. But when he saw Carlos's expression, he chose to remain silent. I don't know what to say. I really don't know what to do now, Carlos muttered, more to himself than to the doctor. The doctor, an experienced man, just shook his head. There are times when words are not enough, sir. Sometimes we need actions, not excuses. Carlos felt as if those words had come from someone much wiser, someone who had already known what it was like to face the shadows of guilt and responsibility. He looked at Lucas again, thinking about what could have been done differently. If he had acted differently, if he had questioned more, perhaps Lucas's fate would have been different. But there was no time to go back now. The doctor stepped aside to allow Carlos to be alone with Lucas for a few moments. Looking at the young man's pale face, Carlos saw something that was impossible to see when looking at him from a position of authority. Lucas's human frailty. He was not just a criminal, as the system made him out to be. He was a victim of circumstance, a reflection of the failings of a world that had not given him many opportunities. There was Carlos, now without his uniform, without the weight of the uniform. He was just a man who somehow knew he had made a mistake. He knew that somewhere he had failed not only Lucas, but himself. The door opened again, and a man entered without warning. Carlos looked at him in surprise. It was Lucas's father, whom he did not immediately recognize. The man looked older than he should have, with gray hair and a tired face. He approached slowly, his eyes fixed on his son, before looking at Carlos. His look was not one of anger, but of deep sadness, as if he already knew what was happening, as if he knew that Lucas was lost, both to the world and to himself. "Are you the police officer who did this to my son?" the man asked, his voice tense but controlled. There was no shouting, no outbursts, just a calmness that betrayed the silent pain of a father who had already faced a loss in his life. Carlos didn't know how to respond. He felt overwhelmed by the situation, but more than that, he felt as if he were facing something bigger than he had ever imagined. I don't know what to say. That's not why I joined the police force. I tried to do the right thing," Carlos stammered, trying to justify his actions, but the words disintegrated at the sadness in his father's eyes. "Did you do the right thing? Or did you just follow the rules?" Lucas's father asked. Carlos didn't know how to answer. It meant that he was doing what he thought was best, that he was doing his duty. But when he looked at that man, he knew that words were not enough to achieve the forgiveness he so desired. Lucas's father was silent for a long moment. He was no longer angry. He no longer wanted to shout. He approached Carlos and, without saying a word, put his hand on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture but full of deep meaning. "Do what's right for my son. He doesn't deserve to be treated like a criminal. Do what's right for him and for yourself," the father said, his voice now soft but firm. Carlos felt the weight of those words like a pressure on his heart. He had lost himself in his own definition of justice, in his own moral code. But there, in the face of that pain, he knew that the law was beyond what he understood. As he stood in silence, looking at Lucas's father and the young man still fighting for his life, a sense of clarity washed over him. He could no longer ignore the humanity of the situation. I had made a mistake. Now I would have to do whatever it took to make it right. Carlos couldn't sleep that night. The room was dark, and the silence around him felt heavier than ever. The image of Lucas's father and the words he had said were etched in his mind, repeating themselves like a relentless echo. The gentle touch of his hand on Carlos's shoulder, like a last attempt to ask for something more. Do the right thing. There was no longer any way to ignore the truth that Lucas's life was in Carlos's hands in a way he had never imagined. He had lost himself in his own justifications, in his duty, in his rules. But as he looked at the man who was losing his son and heard the words he had not said but had conveyed with his silence, Carlos knew that true justice was not what he knew. There was something much deeper at stake. The clock on the wall read 3 a.m. Time was running out, and I knew I had to make a decision. In court he had been firm, but his conviction was no longer intact. The evidence was clear, but I felt that it wasn't everything. It was about more than the evidence, more than the actions of the moment. It was about a young man's future, the weight of his decisions. He couldn't just let Lucas pay for something that might be more a consequence of the system than his actions. Carlos got out of bed and walked to the window. Outside, the city seemed peaceful, almost indifferent to the turmoil going on inside. He thought about what Luke's father had said, "Do the right thing." What did that mean? Doing the right thing wasn't simply about following the rules, but about being able to look beyond the evidence and recognize the humanity that each person carries. I knew I needed to act. In the morning, he was admitted to the hospital earlier than usual. The atmosphere was silent, almost desolate. The nurses were busy, and the smell of disinfectant in the air only added to the feeling of discomfort. Lucas's room was at the end of the hallway, and when Carlos entered, the young man was still there, immersed in the total darkness of a coma, with the monitors beeping softly in the background. Lucas's father was still there, sitting in a chair next to his son's bed, his head down and lost in thought. When Carlos walked in, the man didn't look up. I already knew why the police officer was there. "I need to talk to you," Carlos said, his voice softer than he intended. Lucas's father slowly raised his head, his eyes tired but kind. He pointed to the chair next to Lucas without saying a word. Carlos sat down, feeling the weight of the moment. "I know what you're thinking, and I know what you're trying to do. But you can't save me from all this pain, and you won't give me my son back," the father said in a low, resigned voice. "But what you can do, what you can still do, is try to fix what was broken." Carlos looked at him, not knowing what to say. He felt a growing pressure in his chest, the feeling that time was running out and that he could no longer postpone the truth. The weight of responsibility seemed to crush him, but at the same time, a strength emerged from within him. "I need to correct my mistake," Carlos said, his voice breaking. "I can't live with this anymore. I can't live with the idea that I was doing the right thing." Lucas's father was silent for a moment before looking Carlos in the eye. There was no longer anger, but quiet recognition. That's how change begins. When people accept their mistakes and seek the truth, that's all any of us can do. So fix it. Do the right thing. Carlos felt something inside him unravel, as if he were finally breaking free from a prison built by his own convictions. I knew what I had to do. It was time to expose the truth, to change the course of everything. He could no longer be part of a system that ignored humanity, that treated people like Lucas as numbers or statistics. I had to do the right thing. Carlos remained there for a few more minutes, in silence. Lucas's father said nothing more. The words had already been said. The decision had been made. Carlos felt as if he were crossing an invisible line, a barrier that, once crossed, could not be undone. The decision he had made that morning, sitting beside Lucas's bed, had been like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He knew he could not turn back now. There was a responsibility greater than the duties of his position or the expectations of his profession. The truth had to come out. In the following days, Carlos remained silent, avoiding the gaze of his colleagues, who noticed his different behavior. But he could no longer ignore what he knew was right. The conversations in the corridors of the police station began to grow more tense, and rumors spread about a possible outcome of the case. But none of that seemed to matter to Carlos anymore. What really mattered was doing what was right for Lucas, his family, and himself. That afternoon, after hours of reflection and analysis, Carlos decided to seek out the prosecutor in charge of the case. He knew that by doing so he was putting his career at risk, but he also understood that there was no other option. Lies, cover-ups, and injustices needed to be exposed. The system had failed him, and he, as part of that system, could no longer be an accomplice. As he entered the prosecutor's office, Carlos felt the weight of his own words. The atmosphere was impersonal, with austere walls and dark furniture that reflected the seriousness of the place. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with an expressionless face, looked at Carlos with a raised eyebrow. "What's the news, officer?" he asked in a cold, almost disinterested voice. Carlos swallowed hard before answering. I didn't know exactly how to begin. He didn't know how to explain the urgency of what he was about to reveal, but he knew he had to begin. "I need to tell the truth about what happened to Lucas," Carlos said, his voice firm, but with a tone that betrayed the seriousness of the moment. The prosecutor looked at him more closely, his eyes now focused but still suspicious. "I don't understand. What are you saying?" The prosecutor's tone began to change, a little more interested but also apprehensive. Carlos took a deep breath and approached the prosecutor's desk. He couldn't afford to hesitate. The time had come to reveal everything. "I and other police officers were responsible for the attack on Lucas. This was no ordinary arrest. We acted without reason, without justification for that violence. We went beyond what our training instructed us to do. I made a mistake." "We made a mistake," he confessed, the words floating in the air. The prosecutor was silent for a moment. The shocked expression on his face was followed by a growing tension. He slowly rose from his chair, looking at Carlos, not knowing exactly how to react to this unexpected confession. "This is a serious charge. Do you know what you're doing? This could destroy your career and the careers of other police officers. Are you sure about this?" the prosecutor asked, disbelief in his voice mixed with concern. Carlos knew what was at stake, but none of that mattered anymore. He had already made his decision. "I know what I'm doing. I can't be an accomplice to this anymore. I can't keep protecting a system that has failed. I need to expose the truth," Carlos said, his gaze fixed on his interlocutor. The prosecutor seemed to absorb those words, as if reflecting on the impact of everything that was being revealed. He went to the window, looked outside, and pondered Carlos's confession. Silence filled the room for a few moments until the prosecutor turned around, finally accepting his weight. "Are you aware that this could have irreversible consequences? Not just for you, but for the entire corporation?" the prosecutor asked, his voice now softer. Carlos felt the pressure of the question, but he already knew the answer. "I couldn't look back anymore." "Yes, I am. I just hope that in the end this brings something good. I can't live knowing that my mistake hasn't been corrected. I can't keep walking as if everything is normal," said Carlos, with a determination that he didn't know he had. The prosecutor nodded slowly, still thinking about what he would do with this information. He knew Carlos wasn't lying, but he also knew that this revelation could create chaos, far greater than anything he had ever faced. "I will do whatever it takes to investigate this," the prosecutor finally said, his voice deeper now, but with some respect for Carlos. "But you have to understand that this journey will not be easy. The whole system could turn against us." Carlos looked at him with a determined expression. There was no longer any doubt in his eyes. He knew what he had done, and he knew what was coming. The only way now was to continue, even if the burden was too heavy to bear. Carlos's confession was a bombshell. At the police station and beyond, within days, the news began to spread. At first, it was just a whisper in the hallways, but it soon became a topic that no one could ignore. Carlos's courage in revealing the truth was met with mixed reception. Some colleagues saw him as a traitor, while others quietly respected him for his honesty. But he knew that the biggest challenges were yet to come. A formal investigation was opened. Carlos was removed from his duties and asked to give detailed statements. I knew this was just the beginning. The officers involved in the case began to protect themselves, creating their own versions of events, but Carlos's statement was a turning point. It set in motion a chain of events that none of them could control. Meanwhile, at Lucas's father's house, the silence gave way to a mixture of hope and apprehension. He followed the news closely, seeing Carlos's name repeated in the headlines and on the news. It was a time when justice was beginning to emerge, but it was also a time of tension. Lucas was still in the hospital in a coma, fighting for his life, and his father knew that the legal battle would be as difficult as the battle for his son's health. Carlos, for his part, faced the loneliness that came with his decision. He had lost the trust of many of his colleagues, and even his family looked at him with fear. His wife Maria supported him, but she couldn't hide her fear of what might happen to him. "You did the right thing, Carlos," she said one night as she held his hand. "But the right thing isn't always easy." Behind the scenes, the prosecutor who heard his confession faced political and institutional pressure. His team was divided between those who wanted to move the case forward and those who feared the repercussions of exposing systemic corruption within the police force. However, the evidence provided by Carlos, internal videos, doctored reports, and his own testimony, was too compelling to ignore. Little by little, the media began to pay more attention to the case. Journalists sought out Carlos relentlessly, but he refused to give interviews. It wasn't about him, he thought. It was about Lucas, his family, and everyone who had suffered the brutality of a failed system. One of those tumultuous days, Carlos received a message from the hospital. Lucas had shown signs of improvement. For the first time in weeks, Lucas's eyes had opened, and he seemed to be struggling to connect with the world around him. Carlos knew he had to visit him, even if he wasn't welcome. When he arrived at the hospital, he found Lucas's father in the hallway, with tears in his eyes. He didn't say anything, but his look said it all. Carlos approached the door of the room, but didn't go in. He stood there, motionless, watching from afar. Lucas was weak, but alive, and that was the only thing that mattered. Lucas's father finally approached, touched Carlos's shoulder, and said softly, "Thank you for not giving up." When Carlos left the hospital, he realized that even with all the challenges he still faced, there was something more powerful than fear, the conviction that he had chosen the right path. And that, deep down, was the only thing that mattered.